Hello, today we're joined by Helen Harris, author of Sylvia Garland's Broken Heart, along with many other novels, and we're going to be talking a bit about the book today. Helen, why don't you begin by introducing yourself?
My name's Helen Harris, and I'm the author of 6 novels, most recently The Brondesbury Tapestry, and before that Sylvia Garland's Broken Heart, which was published at the end of 2014, but it's become uncannily relevant suddenly now during the pandemic, because the main theme of the book is the agony of a grandmother who becomes separated from her grandchild. And while in Sylvia Garland's Broken Heart, what I was writing about was the plight of grandparents when their children separate or when they get divorced, coronavirus has created that situation across the world for a whole generation of grandparents who suddenly find their grandchildren have become unreachable.
How do you think Sylvia Garland would have reacted to COVID-19?
That's a very interesting question, and I did think about it, and I'm afraid initially I think Sylvia's reaction would be simply unprintable. I think she would have been a late adopter of hand washing, distancing and face mask wearing. I think she would have regarded it all as rather ridiculous, and I think Sylvia wouldn't have been exemplary in the way she reacted at all.
So, as you say, this is very much a novel about a grandparent who is struggling to see her grandson. And why do you think grandparents are often forgotten when it comes to questions of childcare and access?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but the answer actually does, I believe, have a basis in law, which is that grandparents don't have a legal right to access to their grandchildren. And there are organisations like the Bristol Grandparents Support Group and other organisations which are working, and even, a few years on, they're still working, that grandparents' rights should be enshrined in law. And I think that's probably the basis. But putting that to one side, I think it's all too easy to understand how in a family structure, if you've never been that keen on your mother-in-law and then you separate from your partner, well, excluding the mother-in-laws could be, in certain circumstances, a happy spin-off. So you can see how the grandparents become sort of collateral damage of the breakup. And that was really what interested me. I wanted the baby, the grandchild, Anand, to be very much the centre of the book and show how his arrival, well, the prospect of his arrival, and then his birth, and then his young childhood, the ramifications across the whole family, what effect on the parents, on the mother, what effect on the grandparents, on both sides, and how when the marriage failed, there were ramifications throughout the family.
In the book, Sylvia seems to see becoming a grandmother as an opportunity to make up for her own mistakes as a mother. Do you think this is something that grandparents experience generally?
It's a very, very interesting question. I think it's impossible to generalise in the answer because everyone is a product of their own childhood, and I'm sure there are plenty of parents who, when they become grandparents, don't feel that there are any major failings in the way they brought their children up that need to be made good. I mean, as you discover in the course of the book, Sylvia had her own really rather tragic reasons why she didn't make that much of a success of being a mother. So that was something intensely personal to her, and I don't think I'd really like to generalise about that.
There's a big focus on technology in the book. Sylvia learns how to text and how to use the internet just as a way of staying in her grandson's life. How do you think Zoom and various other video conferencing tools have affected grandparents' relationships with their grandchildren during the pandemic?
Well, we all love to hate Zoom, of course. In fact, there are a lot of things that you can do with a grandchild on the other side of the ocean on Zoom. Obviously, you can't sit them on your lap. That's where the whole thing falls apart. But you can do drawing, you can read stories, you can play games together. There's a lot of things that you can actually do. So I think it's just an absolute blessing. I was a bit, not dismayed, but I was slightly surprised when some friends of ours showed us how they FaceTimed with their little grandson in California, who they haven't yet met because he was born shortly before the pandemic hit, and they have all those little ears and funny faces and all the tricks that you can play to give yourself a different personality. And I think the child may be very disappointed when the grandparents arrive that they haven't actually got whiskers and funny hats, and so I think one has to be careful how one uses it.
Now, the novel deals very frankly with not only Sylvia's failings and shortcomings, but also her daughter-in-law's, Smita's. And it seems like you have a very balanced characterization. Was it important for you to avoid making a perfect protagonist? And if so, why?
Well, Sylvia Garland is uniquely unheroic, I think, as a protagonist. And what I was interested in very much was this idea of the cross-cultural marriage and how that would affect the extended family beyond the couple. And so I wanted to have a young British Asian female character as the wife, as the mother of Sylvia's grandchild. And then once I had the idea of her, certainly who I wanted her to be, and I started thinking about her in more depth, in a way Sylvia's reactions to her just came automatically, because I knew how Sylvia would react to such a young woman, which would be a mixture of gushing over compensation and unfamiliarity and wariness. And in fact, as the book goes on, she has a revelatory moment quite late on when she observes Smita, her daughter-in-law, as a new mother and finds her too cold and too distant with the baby, and then realizes with a sudden horrible shock of self-recognition that she would have behaved exactly the same way herself.
Now, another question is, I very much enjoyed the story of Mrs. Rosencrantz in the book. Now, why was it important for you to include that character?
Well, there were two aspects to it. One was structural to the book and the other was personal to me. I was aware that I was focusing too narrowly on just the members of the family, and that the book needed to be widened out. It needed to be more populated. A family isn't a bubble except in COVID times. A family has friends and neighbours and all sorts of relationships. And I knew I needed to include some more characters in the book, and I wanted Sylvia to have a friend. And so that was the structural reason. And the personal reason was, again, the question of encountering difference. And Mrs. Rosencrantz is very different. She's an elderly lady of German Jewish origin. And she has obviously been through some very terrible experiences in her past. And meeting her and interacting with her is actually part of Sylvia's recovery, because Sylvia arrives widowed in London in a state of trauma, imagining the worst thing possible has happened to her, and hearing the story of this older woman who's been through things immeasurably worse in her lifetime. It's very helpful to Sylvia to listen to that.
And finally, how have you been spending your time during the pandemic?
I've completed one project, which was I wanted to write some memoir, which I never have before, but I'm not at all sure what I'm going to do with it now. So for now I've done the classic thing of put it away in the drawer and forget about it. And I've been writing some short stories. and I'm a Russian speaker, and I've been spending a lot of time working on my Russian, doing Russian classes on Zoom, and I've read Master and Margarita in Russian from cover to cover, which nearly finished me off, and trying to be as helpful as I can to other people, given that I'm well aware that I've been a lot less badly affected thus far by the pandemic than many other people.
Helen Harris, thank you very much for joining us. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed talking to you.